Okay, so stop me if you've heard of this before.
Some 800 hotspots have been detected throughout the islands, with the bulk of them in West Kalimantan, Central Kalimantan and Riau.
The peak of the dry season was supposed to end in August, but months later, little has changed.
Droughts, fires, floods, forests disappearing, and people being forced to move from their lands because they can't live there anymore. It's like a depressing game of bingo that you've played 100 times before. But if we just pause the game for a bit and step back, we can start to see just how we got here. If we piece together the events that led us here, we'll start to understand how people in power perpetuate false narratives about nature, how governments treat the land like a natural and political resource, and how indigenous peoples often get left behind to pick up the pieces. So, just how long can humans take from the land before the land starts to push back? The key to understanding this story is understanding all the different relationships that are going on. The relationship between the people and the land, the government and the people, and so on and so forth. Our story will span hundreds of years and thousands of kilometers, and will have many different actors. Governments, colonial powers, indigenous peoples, and if you just keep this tool handy, you'll start to be able to see the patterns that emerge. The first relationship we'll talk about is extraction. Maybe when you think of extraction, you'll think of this. But the practice and the legacy of extraction in Indonesia goes way back to the 1800s, where the Dutch would cut down large swaths of forests either to harvest valuable teak wood, either to make ships or to export, or to make room for the cultivation of cash crops like indigo, coffee, and sugar, an incredibly damaging practice known as kulturstelsel. Of course, the Dutch colonists were far removed from the consequences of their actions. The only thing that was going through their minds was, how do I enrich the metropole? Which is another word for mother city or headquarters, which in their case was The Hague in the Netherlands. It was so easy to make these decisions because they didn't have to live with the consequences of their environmental damage. Now, fast forward 100 years or so, and surely things will be different, right?
Proklamasi kami, bangsa Indonesia.
Well, the land may be under new management, but the systems of extraction, they stuck around. For post-independence Indonesia, the land was once again a resource. Sukarno awarded land to his political supporters to consolidate power. And it only gets worse from here. Under Suharto, the timber industry exploded in size. By 1972, Indonesia was competing with Malaysia for global leadership in the export of tropical hardwood. International corporations were making a massive profit, and to a certain extent, so was the government through things like taxes and investments. But this massive profit was only possible because the cost of deforestation and environmental damage was falling on the people of Kalimantan. And so once again, those who controlled and stood to gain the most from this trade were those who are furthest removed from the consequences of that trade. Okay, so maybe now you're thinking, cool, Daniel, but this is the spiel that I've heard 1,000 times before. What's new? What's unique about what's happening in Kalimantan? Well, extraction doesn't stop at mining or logging. Another way that governments treat their lands as a resource is through transmigration. Simply put, transmigration is the mass relocation of people within the borders of a country. Under the Dutch, transmigration was done to relieve densely populated regions of the country. Java was growing as the breadbasket of the archipelago, but as its capacity to grow crops grew, so did its population. Okay, so as an aside, an important point that you should remember is that Java has incredibly fertile soil and has the right climate for growing crops like rice. Remember that. Even after Indonesia gains its independence, transmigration still treats the land like it's a currency that it can hand out to people, either as political favors to consolidate power or to tie distant and underdeveloped regions back to the Indonesian metropole of Jakarta. Now, transmigration introduces a whole different avenue of destruction to the land. At best, transmigration ignores the fact that 1. Mass arrival of people often necessitate deforestation for the creation of farmland and housing. And 2. That these lands may already be home to indigenous peoples who are often displaced in this process. But it gets worse. Transmigration often serves as fait accompli to develop an area, which usually means to make it more accessible for extraction and export. And 2, transmigration allows the government to assimilate and exercise control over the indigenous peoples of the area, who they often view as underdeveloped. So here's what it looks like. The government designates an area for transmigration and begins clearing the forest to make land for building infrastructure. In many cases, the indigenous peoples aren't part of this decision-making process. They're issued land titles, but these land titles aren't worth much. The national government would often issue these same lands to new settlers and corporations, with the indigenous peoples often losing whenever there's a land dispute. But the inequalities don't stop there. Sponsored migrants from Java are often given housing, food rations, and other services in the name of national development. But the indigenous people are expected to provide their own housing in their own farmlands. And when these different communities become more and more urban, the inequalities are further exacerbated. Migrant settlers from Java and Sumatra often have better access to education, and this leads to local communities being passed up for job opportunities. And while all this was happening, the logging, the farming, the building of settlements, the land in Kalimantan was changing. It's bountiful, sure, but it's not infinite. You can't just keep taking from the land. At some point, the land pushes back. Logging left millions of hectares of forest bare. Deforestation meant the destruction of biodiversity. And you remember what I said about Java being the breadbasket of the archipelago? Well, the national government pushed migrants to make Kalimantan the same. Except it didn't work. The soil in Kalimantan just wasn't compatible with the agricultural methods that these migrants brought with them, leading to further ecological damage and in some cases, starvation. The massive loss of forest also meant worse flooding and worse droughts, which results in disaster-induced migrations. After decades of degradation, the land can no longer support people. And yet again, the government and the corporations, the main drivers behind the environmental degradation in Kalimantan, aren't the ones paying the price. It's the indigenous peoples whose lands have been culturally and literally destroyed, and who have been left out of the economic benefit that development supposedly promised. It's also the migrants who are essentially living on borrowed time and are often left high and dry when the corporations are done extracting from the area. The story of Kalimantan is essentially a warning. The systems that we saw here, the belligerent extracting of resources, the treatment of land as a natural and political resource, and the complete disregard for the sanctity and the right of indigenous people and their land, they can happen anywhere in Southeast Asia and the rest of the world. Even now, Indonesia has signed legislation that will move the capital city from Jakarta to Nusantara, which is in East Kalimantan.
Undang tentang Ibu Kota Negara telah disahkan dan telah menjadi komitmen bersama antara pemerintah dan DPR RI.
The stage is set for this to happen all over again. So, what can I do, you might ask? Well, we've included a list of organizations that are working to mitigate environmental degradation in Kalimantan. You can also find out whether your province, district, or city is a contributor to environmental degradation or is in fact exporting or importing transmigrants. Ultimately, we need to remember that our relationship with the land is not one way. There will be consequences for our actions, and the land will push back.